Bricru of the Bidatang had started a dispute between Cuchulainn and his friends Conall Cernach and Laoghaire Budach. Each of them thought themselves to be worthy of the champion's portion of a feast, for they all thought they were the greatest warrior in all of Ulster. The dispute came to a point where Crogha of Ulster was at a loss as how to solve this. Instead, he decided to send all three of the warriors to Connacht, to the court of King Ailill and Queen Maeve, to have them decide which of the three heroes deserved the champion's portion. And so, the three warriors made their way to Connacht. But before they even arrived in Connacht, Cuchulainn mocked his peers by telling them, while still in Ulster, that they should already go ahead, for they would never be able to keep up with his chariot. He just had tamed the two fastest horses in all of Ireland, Lia Macha, the Grey of Macha, and Dubh-Sangland, the Black of Sanglia. Both of those horses he had found at the Len Lea, a lake in the mountains of Schlieffua. They were a gift of Macha, a gift that had to be earned. He had to leap on both horses' backs and stay on it, while they did everything to throw him off. Once he managed that, they were tame and would be his faithful companions for the rest of his life. With those horses, he made the way in no time, and arrived ahead of his peers, even though he had stayed back in Emain Macha for a very long while, after his comrades were already gone. Once they finally all arrived, the heroes of Ulster were greeted by a warm welcome in Connacht. Even though this might just have been for Maeve's fear that they would try to declare war on her kingdom. But who knows? Sometime later, King Crogha and his entourage arrived after them, explaining what happened to the King and Queen of Connacht, and pleading for a judgment. For Crogha trusted only the judgment of wise Ailill about who of the heroes should receive the champion's portion of Ulster. While King Ailill still had to think about the request, King Crogha already returned to Emain Macha, leaving only Cuchulainn, Conall and Laoghaire behind. The three heroes each stayed in their own separate rooms, waiting for a way to determine who of them deserved the champion's portion. But when night fell, Queen Maeve secretly had already chosen a test to determine who of them deserved the portion. She went to the Fairy Mounds and opened a door to the Otherworld, letting three monstrous cats into this realm. The three beasts each made their way into one of the heroes' rooms. It didn't take any of the Ulstermen long before they spotted the intruders. But while Conall and Laoghaire hid in fear before the monsters, leaving them to cause havoc in their rooms, Cuchulainn faced the demon cat coming into his room. He tried to kill it with a blow of his sword on its head, but that was of no avail. Still, Cuchulainn didn't budge, and stared directly into the eyes of the beast. The hero and the cat continued staring at each other, until finally the sun came up in the morning, causing the beast to vanish back into the Otherworld. When the court of Connacht heard about what happened that night, Conall and Laoghaire started to protest that this wasn't a fair contest. They were prepared to fight, but men, not monsters. This couldn't be taken as a basis for the king's judgment. But the queen had none of it. Maeve went to her husband, declaring that there was no doubt but it was Cuchulainn who was the greatest of the Ulstermen. But Ailill was hesitant. He feared that no matter what judgment he would make, the other two men would turn on the winner, leaving Connacht in a bad light and causing Ulster to declare war on Connacht. But Maeve was wise and quickly came up with a plan. She called for Laoghaire and presented him with a bronze cup with silver ornaments, telling him he should present this as a token of his victory to the court of Ulster, But by his honor, he wasn't allowed to tell the others until the next feast in Iman Macha. Then she called Conall to her side, giving him a silver cup with golden ornaments, and telling him exactly the same. And at last she called Cuchulainn to her side, presenting him with a golden cup decorated with jewels, and telling him the same thing she had told the others. All three heroes were satisfied, and couldn't wait to leave for home, to claim their reward in Eamon Macha. Back in Ulster, each of the men claimed the champion's portion for themselves, showing the cup they had received as a token. But when Cror declared that Cuchulainn was declared the victor by the king's couple in Connacht, Laoghaire and Conall started to argue. They declared that Cuchulainn must have bought the token, not won it. And within a heartbeat, the three men were back at each other's throats. It took a lot of time and patience for Cror and his advisor Seneca to separate the three men, and to finally calm them down. When the three warriors finally let off each other, Cror decided that this situation had to be resolved once and for all. Ailill of Connacht might have failed, but maybe Cuirí mac Doire, the wise king of Munster, could find a just judgment to finally settle this matter. There had to be a way to determine who of those lads were the mightiest of the warriors of Ulster, and worthy of the champion's portion. And if there were, Cuirí would find it. The king had them solemnly swear to obey whatever judgment Cuirí would give, until he finally sent them on their way. When Laoghaire, Conall and Cuchulainn arrived at the fort of Cuirí, they were greeted by his daughter Blanid. For the wise Cuirí himself was travelling around Ireland at the time. But Cuirí wasn't just wise, he was also skilled in magic, and so he always knew what was going on at his home, even if he was far away. And he was always able to transmit messages. As soon as the warriors of Ulster had arrived, Blanid already had instructions from her father. And so, Blanid instructed the three warriors what their competition would be. She told them that her father protected this fort in a magical way, and that every night the fort would rotate and hide all its entrances, until the sun finally started to dawn again. She pointed at the space on top of the fort, where a single man could stand guard, and exactly that would be their task. Each of them would have to guard the fortress for one whole night. The three warriors looked at each other. This task seemed to be too easy, but even though they had to suspect a trap, they had no choice but to accept. When the first night began to dawn, it was Laoghaire's turn to guard the fort. And as soon as the light was gone, all entrances were hidden, and the night was eerily quiet. At first. Suddenly, he heard a deep rumble. He looked around and saw a giant coming closer. The giant plucked trees out of the earth as if they were flowers, and threw them like spears towards Laoghaire. He was barely able to avoid being hit, and desperately tried to defend himself by throwing his own spear back towards the giant. But it was of no use. The giant came closer and closer, and Laoghaire continued to dodge the trees, until the giant was close enough to reach out to the young warrior. He picked him up like a toy, and in one swift movement threw him over the fort, onto the other side. When the next day dawned, and the people inside the fort found Laoghaire on the wrong side of the fort, they assumed that he might just have leaped over the wall to mock his opponents. And since Laoghaire couldn't admit what really happened, He just went with that story to keep his face and his chance to win the competition. When the second night came, Conall had to take guard. He also met the giant, and he also was thrown over the fort. And just like Laoghaire, he left the people believing what they wanted, too embarrassed to admit what really happened in the previous night. Finally, it was Cuchulainn's turn. But this night started out different than his opponents. Just after the night had dawned, he saw lights coming over the hill from afar. They came closer and closer, and Cuchulainn identified them as warriors in their own rights. He warned them to step no further, for if they do, he would have to kill them. But of course they did not obey, and instead attacked the young hero. It was an easy task for him to slay the bunch and pile up their heads, but it wasn't over. A second wave of warriors came towards him, and finally a third. Cuchulainn slew all of them, piling up their heads, when suddenly he heard the same noise his competitors had heard the night before, and he saw the giant coming towards him. He dodged the trees, just as Laoghaire and Conall had done. But when the giant was finally close enough to reach for the young warrior, he jumped onto the giant's arm, ran up to his shoulder, and decapitated his opponent, adding his severed head to the pile. But the night wasn't over yet, and Cuchulainn didn't want to do anything less than his companions. And so he tried to leap over the fort, just like they said they had done. But he couldn't. He tried again and again, reaching only the mere half of the height, until his rage about his inability became so prominent that it triggered his berserker mode, gave him more power and the strength he needed to salmon leap over to the other side. In the morning, the people didn't just find Cuchulainn like his companions on the wrong side of the fort, but also a huge pile of severed heads. Blanid, who knew about the giant, smiled and declared Cuchulainn the victor of this challenge. But Laoghaire and Conall felt betrayed and had none of it. They speculated that the young hero must have had help from the other world, and they refused to accept that he had bested them. While the three Ulstermen still argued, Blanid received a message from her father, who had seen everything that was going on. He had her tell the warriors to go home. He would send someone to Eamon Macha to end this dispute once and for all. And so, the Ulstermen left without a decision. When the warriors arrived back home at Eamon Macha, Croa wasn't satisfied that there still was no solution. But he was content to wait for the mysterious stranger Cúree wanted to send to mend the situation. But since he already had the feast in order to celebrate the decision being prepared, he decided to give the feast either way. And so, all three of the warriors and all the court of Eamon Macha attended a feast that night. The sun was barely going down when suddenly a stranger entered the doors of the feasting hall. The crowd went silent when this giant of a man went forth to face the king. He declared that he was Ulf, sent by Cúree to settle the matter of who was the mightiest warrior of Ireland. But he doubted to find any man of this caliber at the court. He challenged every warrior sitting in the hall to accept his challenge if they were brave enough. He challenged the bravest man to step forward, take his axe, and to behead him, but under one condition, that he, Ulf, would have the right to do the same to them during the next night. The people of the hall were shocked. Was that man mad? Did he really want someone to behead him? But Ulf was serious and mocked the Ulsterman for being too cowardly to take his challenge. Seeing this as a light task and eager to finally get the champion's portion, Leary accepted the challenge, took the stranger's axe, and severed Ulf's head from his body in one single blow. To his shock, though, Ulf wasn't dead. He just stood up, took his head, and put it back onto his shoulders. Leary went pale. He was terrified. But Ulf just declared that he would return the next day to take his turn. The next evening came, and all of Imanmaka was gathered to see the outcome of the challenge. All but Leary. He was so terrified that he had left Ulster to not have to face the consequences of the challenge. Ulf just laughed at the Ulstermen, declaring them to be cowards and not true to their word, unworthy to be called real warriors. Conall decided that he couldn't stand this mockery. He went forward and also accepted the challenge. Conall grabbed the axe, let Ulf lay his head on the chopping block, took his blow, and then took another one, chopping the severed head in half. But again, Ulf just got up, took both halves of his head, and declared that he would return the next day to take his turn. And Conall went even paler than Leary. When Ulf returned the next night, and all of Imanmaka was gathered again to see what would happen, there was no trace of Conall. And again Ulf mocked the men of Ulster, until Cuchulainn couldn't take it anymore, and also accepted the challenge. Ulf grinned, laid his head down on the chopping block, and once again waited. Cuchulainn took Ulf's axe and, like his companions, severed the head from Ulf's body. Then he went ahead and chopped the head into smaller pieces. But once more, Ulf just got up, took the pieces of his head, and declared he would return the next day. But when the next day came, and Imanmaka was gathered once more, Cuchulainn did not run away. He did not intend to die, and he was devastated, thinking that the prophecy he would die young he once got from Kavard would finally come true. But he had his honor, and was ready to hold up his end of the bargain. The people of Ulster were devastated, and pleaded with Cuchulainn that he should flee, so they wouldn't lose him. But Cuchulainn was ready to face Ulf again. And sure enough, Ulf arrived, acknowledging the bravery of Cuchulainn to face him again. The young warrior put his head on the chopping block, ready to face his fate. Ulf asked the young lad whether he had any last words, but Cuchulainn just asked him to finally do what he had come to do. And so, Ulf took up his axe, raised it far above his head, and while all of Imanmaka held their breath, brought it down, gently, placing it on the ground next to the young warrior. Cuchulainn looked at him in confusion, but Ulf just smiled, and suddenly changed his appearance, revealing that he was Cúree all along. He declared that this has been the final test, a test of bravery and honor, and Cuchulainn had been the only one of the three warriors who had passed, for all of Imanmaka to see. There was no more doubt about who deserved the champion's portion. Berekru's mischief was finally resolved. And from this day on, Cuchulainn was known as the greatest warrior in all of Ireland. And this is the end of the second part of the tale of Berekru's feast. If you liked the video, please leave a thumbs up, subscribe, and ring the bell to be notified when the next episode comes out. See you next time. Slan slan!